Yeah, so we're now delayed as usually, moving into our second half of the show. So our deep dive today is a segment we call Crossing the Rubicon, in which either something big is about to happen or something big has happened, in which we want a certain thing to happen. We want Bernie Sanders to get all the power in the world and go change it all for the better. Now, what could the problems possibly become with that? And so it's a segment in which we discuss the pros, the cons, in which we take different stances and sometimes simply think out loud. And this segment is going to be on the Brexit. So just as we accidentally skipped the international news segment, which I am now bringing up here. And one of the parts on this international news segments is that after the vote to leave the EU, in the UK, they have seen a sharp rise in hate crimes, both the reporting of hate crimes, but also people getting assaulted and attacked. And there are some very powerful personal stories out there. There is at NPR. You can find the link in the description. NPR has a story about a German woman who live in the UK and how she is. The dog excrement was thrown at her door, and she was told to go back home. And she has been living in London for 43 years. So there are some very ugly things surfacing in the UK. People feeling empowered behind the vote to leave the EU because of UKIP, one of the parties in the UK, which has been for quite some time wanting the UK to leave the EU. Nigel Farage, which is one of their big figures, he has been a harsh critic of the EU from within the European Parliament. And they have a very xenophobic and racist part of their party composition. They are a far right-wing party, but on nationalism and on xenophobia. But as with many of these xenophobic parties, they are on other issues. They are very left-wing. So, for example, labor and workers' rights and stuff like that, they're very left-wing. So it is, in my opinion, it is their rise to power. It is the fact that they were successful in making the vote around the referendum to leave or stay in the EU. They were successful in centering that around being about immigration. And because it was about that, the emboldenedness came off of that, just as I believe that Donald Trump, just by his mere existence now, because of his radical language, is enabling and empowering racists and bigots in the US. You have the same thing happening in the UK off of the UKIP. Now, on top of that, in other international news, NATO and Russia, depending on who you're reading, if you're listening to a US general from before the vote, Brexit being voted in the affirmative of the UK leaving the EU would basically lead to the destabilization of all of Europe and NATO's downfall and Russia's rise to power. Not in any way hyperbolic. And what has happened in the aftermath is that people have been accusing Russia of putting fingers on the scale in the UK election somehow. I'm not sure how, but somehow because they benefit from it, they feel, because a divided Europe, UK leaving is apparently completely and utterly dividing Europe. Then now they will be better at playing Europe and the UK off of against each other, and now that Russia will now have a field day in the former Eastern Bloc and just taking whatever they want. Now this might happen, but so far it hasn't. actually it has happened while the UK was a part of the EU with Ukraine. But let's just ignore all those facts and just run around without our heads on saying that everything's going to end. Now, one of the things that has happened is that the General Secretary of NATO has started talks with the EU and with the UK and said that this is a time for the NATO to simply start organizing better and coordinating better again in an attempt to curb Russian foreign policy adventures. So while there are certainly conflict in the world, and while Russia is certain to try to exploit this in any way, shape, or form possible, the world still stands. Yet. So in international news, there are not a lot of good news. Most of you will have heard about the terrorist attack in Turkey in the airport, the Ataturk airport of Istanbul, in which 60 or more people were killed and injured. So the international news seems to be dominated by bad news, but in the midst of all of this, we also at the same time have to remember that several 100,000 airplanes take off and land each day without anyone dying, that millions upon millions of cars interact with each other on roads with a minimum of deaths compared to the amount of people driving them. So yeah, if it bleeds, it leads is a saying within news media, and bad news leads the best. But remember, there are good news out there. You just have to go look for them. So without any further ado, I would like to invite my panel and several aneurysm in Richard to try and micromanage that Adair, Brandon, and I, and hopefully Richard as well, are going to have a discussion about the Brexit and about both the nature of the hate crimes with the Brexit, but also having me on as a European perspective and as a person against the EU, at least in its current forms. We're going to try and have a discussion about what's happening and what could happen. So, Brandon, I know you have a big take on the UK voting to leave. What do you have to say?
Well, I mean, I think we're seeing nationalism on the rise all over Europe for the same reason we're seeing nationalism on the rise all over America, and that is because of the economic collapse. So you see this sort of desire to close off borders, to scapegoat people from outside, to sort of re-solidify national identity as being inherently good and outside sources being inherently bad. But it's not the end of the world. It's just not. I'm always wary when people try to tell you that this decision is going to be the end of the world. Same with the Trump-Clinton sort of dynamic, where if you vote for Trump, it's the end of the world. So we better just keep, it's better to just keep hobbling along. The way the EU was structured right now it wasn't functional. It's not functional. It's asymmetric in power, and we see a lot of smaller, traditionally poorer countries like Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, watching their economies tank, while other countries like Germany, their economies are sort of booming. So I don't know if this decision is going to be for the best in the short term, but in the long term, if it causes a restructuring of the EU and the power dynamics within Europe to be more equal, or rather more equitable, I think it's for the best. Having control over your own currency is what allows a lot of countries to stave off these mass economic collapses that we saw in Greece.
Yeah, so let's speak to that. So the UK pound plummeted right after Brexit, and then it went back up again, and then it stabilized. And while it was plummeting, people were screaming bloody murder and end of the world, and see, we were right, Brexit, complete economic collapse, and there was a lot of money lost. But depending on who you speak with, it was either a catastrophe or not really a big deal. So what's your take on that?
Change is scary. I mean, like everyone has convinced themselves that the EU is what has always been, and that the way the UK is what how like, they're now talking about Scotland, uh, sort of. I got it. What's the word? I don't know what the sort of separating themselves from the UK now to become to stay as part of the EU,
Mhm.
and so people have convinced themselves that the EU is this sort of has a long history in European cooperation and unity when it's like 50 years old. Like it's been like there are people who are older than the EU are. Like we have people who are older than the EU are who are running marathons and and winning them. So I it's easy to sort of forget that these things are transient and that they go through a lot of phases. I mean, the EU was an experiment. Like it is what it is. The EU was an experiment to see if we could sort of have a global, well, not we, but if they could have a sort of global interconnected Europe. And in certain ways, I like the EU. I like the idea of sort of a standard for goods and services. And so, you don't have to worry about your meat coming from Greece being less of a worse quality than your meat coming from somewhere like Norway.
Mhm.
But at the same time, having one currency when there was such a unequal distribution of wealth in Europe was a bad idea. Like that just I can't imagine that
You keep
being.
talking about the EU in the past tense. Do you see the UK leaving the EU as the beginning of the end?
I've been hearing talk of. Okay, so like I think a lot of people I guess in America this a lot of not America United States this came as sort of a surprise to a lot of people because we've been so focused on the marathon that is the American presidential race that we haven't really been focusing on the situation in Europe. But there's been dissatisfaction between the UK and the EU, and Greece and the EU, and Italy and the EU, and all these countries in the EU for a very long time. And
Yeah.
so, yes, this is not the beginning of the end. The beginning of the end happened a long time ago. This is just this is the first. I don't want to say the first rat to desert a sinking ship, but this is just the first. This is going. Hopefully this is the impetus for restructuring of the EU and what it is supposed to be.
Okay. So just to round that off, the Guardian has an article saying that the UK is basically without leadership and the economy is tanking, and that it's basically the end of the world. Whereas if you go to a news site called Anti-Media, they have done a piece saying the 400 richest people took a big hit, but the overall people of the UK, Europe, and America didn't feel a thing. So just to say that there's like there must be a place in between those two, in which it can we can all coexist. I read an article in the Financial Times, and just to remind everyone, any article we mention here are in the video description. You can find them there. So the Financial Times had an article on the Brexit in which the author sees this vote as an anti-globalization movement led by the right wing. Now, in my opinion, he ignores Corbyn. He was formerly for staying in the EU, but he didn't lift a finger for it. And he's also forgetting Bernie Sanders, who's also anti-globalization. So, Adair, let me get your 2 cents on this.
So, at least from my understanding with the economic impact of the Brexit, here's the concerns that have been raised by the economists that I've read. London became Europe's version of New York, and they're afraid of a large-scale recession worse than what happened in 2008 happening again in the long term. The long-term economic outlook for the Brexit is not good, simply because of the way the trade deals are set up with the US and everyone else. They have the 2 years in which to figure all that out and to play ball with the EU and kind of try to get that good deal. Now, me personally, I would like to see a total lack of borders in general, and I apologize if things go a little bit wonky. My screen is now flashing at me, but I would expect to see, I would love to see rather, a lack of borders and just this kind of universal standard, as Brandon mentioned earlier. I would love to see this universal standard to kind of put, if we're going to push back against globalization in its current form, we should do it in a constructive manner. For example, I would say if, in North America, for example, let's knock down the border between Mexico and Canada and allow free movement of labor and goods, and at the same time tell companies, hey, if you're going, you need to pay, let's say, $15 an hour to all of your employees at minimum, no matter which country they're in, right? Say you need to, that's the minimum, that's our requirement, so they're less likely than to move down to the quote-unquote cheaper labor in Mexico. And sure, you're going to have more people moving up north from Mexico into America, which I think, personally, I find to be fine. I mean, the Mexican people are indigenous to this continent. The border's just a travesty all around. But it lessens that benefit that companies are currently getting from trying to find, bringing people over the border. I believe it was Tyson that's done that, where they've been in trouble for actually sending managers to plants and saying, no, you need to bring in more illegals. Like that will curb that. I think that would solve a lot of the issues that we're seeing right now with what globalization is as it stands. And I think the EU had that part right. I think they had that part right about a universal set of standards, about allowing labor to move freely between countries. Now, I'm not from Europe, so for here in America, it was always held up as this kind of gold standard for liberals. This is where we want to be. We want to be more like the EU. You can move freely, you can go where you want, you can do all these things. But frankly, the Brexit turns a lot of that on its head, and a lot of the narrative that I'm seeing, at least, is coming through from UKIP. Is coming through the narrative of the motivating factor for the Brexit was the brown people are coming, and that changes the narrative, and then the economic impact is quite frankly frightening. The day the Brexit went through, the pound fell to its lowest point in over 30 years, and right now it's slightly stronger than the dollar. $1 is 0.75 British pounds, so it's recovered quite nicely. But the global impact, UK is going to lose their standing as the third largest economy in the world. They're probably going to be overtaken by China. They're not going to have as stable footing with everyone else going forward, and it's just a hard life to live.
Why not?
Why not?
Yeah.
So
there are several countries surrounding the EU which trades and are in partnership with the EU without being full members of the EU. So you can be a part of the market, of the common market, as it was used to be called. You can be a part of that by being part of something called EFTA.
Yes.
There are ways in which the UK can keep trading, no problem. They can also keep being a part of the Schengen Cooperation, which is UKIP's biggest stick about wanting to leave the EU, is that they don't want to be part of the Schengen area in which there are no borders, in which labor moves freely. And they want to leave that partnership, but they do not have final say. The referendum may have passed on leaving the EU, but how they leave the EU and how many of the treaties surrounding the EU, which are not officially part of it, they can still be part of, is not settled. So why put act like the writings on the wall on the EU and the UK and the next World War, basically?
Because if you're to leave the EU in this kind of manner, if that is the big stick, is you want to control immigration. That was one of the biggest talking points in the UK, specifically England and Wales, was we want to control who comes into our borders. That's a huge part of what the EU is economically, is that movement of labor and goods. So the UK might not have as high a bargaining position to maintain that. So if they want to, for example, say you're going to need a work visa to come into Britain and work now. Other countries and the rest of the EU in general could easily say, well, hey, Britain's already here. You need to now apply for a work visa. You need to do X, Y, and Z to get this. They don't have as good a bargaining seat with the EU. The US will have to renegotiate their trade agreements with the UK, assuming that, let's say worst case scenario, the UK breaks off completely. We're going to do our own. that's a disaster situation. That's not a recession. That's a crash. If they play ball with the EU and they basically are following these regulations without having any seat at the table, then the referendum to leave, in my mind, makes zero sense at all. But their status as one of the
that's the bureaucracy of it. That's the politics of it. Like in Denmark, we were asked if we want to join with the Edinburgh Accord. We were that was what founded the EU, transition from the ECC to the EU, EEC to the EU, and Denmark voted no. And we were one of the member countries, and the previous agreement said that no further treaties could be signed or effectuated without all member countries signing to it. So Denmark saying no completely halted the EU project, and that couldn't stand. So even though we had voted no by the same margin that the referendum, the Brexit referendum, a year and a half later, you have the Lisbon. And there you then have a new Danish referendum on the exact same things, except now we are exempt from the currency and the military cooperation. And then we have a new vote, knowing that it was so close. They knew that they could swing it the 5%, and they did. And the vote to join the EU was won by less than the vote to stay out was won by before. So, I mean, you say that it makes no sense. It's politics. It's bureaucracy. It's those people getting what they want. Now, Brandon has been waiting to chime in for a while, so we're going to get his perspective while I dig up some more dirt.
Well, I mean, I just want to bring up, I mean, we keep saying globalization as though, like, there's just one view of globalization, when really, and so it's being mobilized in this sort of anti-Brexit, by the anti-Brexit camp, as this sort of globalization is just some sort of rainbow, hugs and kisses, hands across Europe project, when really, like, the immigration that we were seeing into Europe, not necessarily between Europeans, was sort of diversity without, diversity without integration. Like, there is a very high amount of ghettos in large parts of Europe, you know, where we have sort of Syrian refugees either being turned away, or if they're allowed in, they're not really being fully integrated into society. So I don't know how much, like, the globalization in this sense seems to mean the free flow of capital. And the same within, you know, NAFTA, the free flow of capital, the free flow of you know, goods, but not necessarily the free flow of people or the integration of people into one society from another. And so I just want to push back against the notion that that the EU or any sort of trade agreement is about some sort of harmony between people, and more about a harmony between sort of bank accounts. I think that's more. This is not
very well put.
This is not the sort of globalization where we see people coming in from Turkey or Africa and being welcomed with open arms into sort of British communities or Italian communities. This is the sort of, you can come here and work with a work visa with little to no hassle in that way, but you're still going to live in these homogenized ghettos, these homogenized communities. And I mean, that's why we see a lot of the sort of I don't know, the poverty rate in Europe rising, and also the crime and terrorist rate attack Europe. It's the sort of lack of integration that has just sort of proliferated throughout Europe.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what I would say to that with the lack of integration, like I grew up with my country getting more and more immigrants, especially from the Middle East, in there, and that was all about the movement of cheap labor. But because for some reason an Iranian academic would sell himself cheaper, at least initially, than a Danish academic, but what they didn't understand was that he would quite fast find out that, oh, so my coworkers are paid twice the amount that I am, so I want the same, because I have the same qualifications, and they usually got it. So I grew up with the immigration, and I have zero problem with immigration. Now, that being said, so when Poland joined the EU, we have a former Eastern Bloc country that had been in economic despair for decades, joining Europe. And one of the first things that started happening very quickly after was that Polish workers started coming to other countries, Germany and Denmark amongst them. And they were willing to accept very low wages. Now, at a time in which we had relatively high unemployment, this was controversial. Soon after that, what started happening was that people started coming to Denmark to study, and they wanted the state stipend for studying. And the Danish state said, no, you're not a Danish citizen. They brought the case all the way to the European High Court, and the European High Court said it's a European citizen, so if a Danish citizen has it, then a European citizen must have it. So the Danish state has to pay out stipends in the hundreds of millions to people who are not Danes. So when you have these issues and you have an unagile EU that does not in any way try to take things into consideration, but are just looking at trade agreements and trying to call that a constitutional basis to from which that a high court can make a decision, then you get resentment. Yeah, Adair?
So I've been reading what's going on in chat, and I haven't replied just yet, but a few things I've been reading, and it ties in really well with what Brandon has been saying, is that in today's current globalization, money moves more freely than people do, you know, and that's the idea, I think, of what globalization currently is. But as Brandon so well put it, you know, that is it. But I would argue that we could change globalization. I would like to see globalization be people being welcomed into these communities, being welcomed together, and this kind of idea of actual globalization as what it was originally meant to be. As to your point, you know, about, you know, the EU saying, hey, we've got our own set of judges and we're going to rule on everybody. And I think that is a problem within the EU, that cultural and historical identities aren't always being respected. I think that is a problem. But I would say this, though, about people moving into the EU. Not everyone's welcome with open arms. But I would say that if, you know, it depends. It's largely kind of, I'm trying to think of the right meritocracy, right? They think it's this kind of meritocracy of, if you're an immigrant to, say, the UK and you hold a PhD or a medical degree, you're considered able to contribute to society and are much more likely to be welcome, just regardless of what your skin color is. If I'm coming from America, at least, if I'm coming from a first world country, I think so. There's that level of, I would say a lot of it is rooted in racism, but I would also say a lot of it is rooted in, you know, this idea that some countries, just by virtue of their economic standing, are better than others. But I know Brandon really wants to jump in.
I mean, I just want to go, like, circle around back to the beginning when we talk about the increase in hate crimes either by Donald Trump or after the Brexit, and make the distinction that these things are not causing hate crimes. Like, Donald Trump is not causing hate crimes. He's not making people racist or more racist. He is revealing, and Brexit is revealing, the sort of deep resentments that are inherent to these cultures that have existed in the margins, in the shadows for a very long time, and that we've been comfortable with existing in the shadows for a very long time because it meant that certain people never had to hear it. And so from a purely I'm not in favor of hate crimes. Let's put it out there right now. And no, I don't support them. But I think that we do have to come to terms with the fact that there was enough people in the UK who were resentful enough of brown people, or maybe just the idea of globalization, whatever that entails to them. And there were enough people in the United States who either were anti-establishment or anti-brown people or anti-terror or whatever Donald Trump is peddling this week. I can't keep up. That these things are getting, they have a huge number of people behind them. And what does that say about our society? These people aren't anomalous. They are part of us. Like, they are part of what we have been breeding in these countries, and we have to face it. We can't just keep pretending it doesn't exist and then pretending like these events that occur or these people are causing them. These are just revealing events. These are like sort of the spark that lights the powder keg. So I mean,
Yeah, no, I was just going to hop in here and say that I think you guys all raised some very important and interesting points regarding this and around the idea of globalization, integration, and versus homogeneity. And I think Europe is in a different situation than the United States, but we saw how it went in the United States. Like, we had to cohabitate with people of different cultures and different groups because that's how we formed our country. Like we were necessitated, and we couldn't exist as a country, an independent country, without some sort of working with other people. Now that meant slavery and subjugation of people. It meant the extermination of a large portion of the population. It meant a lot of other things that we wouldn't traditionally fit under that generic category. But of working together, but that it took a recognition. We dealt with it, not well, and I think very poorly, but we kind of dealt with it. Europe hasn't had to deal with that kind of integration, especially from the Middle East, on the same level as a united group. Each individual country has dealt with their own issues, and they've come up with their own solutions. But as a larger group, as an entity of Europe at large, that they haven't dealt with what that means. Like we have Chinatowns, we have Amish groups, we have the Netherlands up in parts of the Northeast. We have segregated communities where these people have segregated themselves within America as well, and it's had beneficial and negative consequences as well. And so that when we're looking at what Europe's trying to do by, like, let's say, taking in millions of refugees and having consistency across, doing something like that is relatively unprecedented, particularly at that level and with that diverse of sovereign nations. And so I think the sovereignty and the concept that these were independent entities, whether it be Germany, France, Britain, or whichever other country, and you touched on it briefly, and I just have to say something. I think this should call more attention to the idea that Scotland and Ireland are part of the UK, but we all think Britain when we think UK, and what that means to them democratically as far as being able to represent themselves in their opinion, particularly around this Brexit vote. But I'm tying a whole lot of stuff in here just because I want to get in here, and I actually enjoy just panning back and forth between you guys, so I just want to get all my stuff out here real quick so I can go back to that. Last little piece was just, but yeah, go ahead, actually, that was it.
Okay, so Pat Hacker has had a couple of comments in here, and I'll address them, but before I do that, I just want to say, if you're joining us, this is Project Sanity, and this is a four-man panel on the Brexit and the UK, the EU, and the US. We are here on the BPD Show's channel, the Benjamin Dixon Show channel, and you can find me and Richard at Progressive Greens on Twitter and at Scandinavia, because I can't spell Scandinavia when I make Twitter accounts. And you can message any of us, me and Nis at progressivearmy.com, or you can find our Google Plus community, Project Sanity. So just to tie into what Pat Hacker is saying, he's saying that the Brexit vote was an anti-multinational corporation vote and not a racist vote. Now, I would like to say that you're both wrong and you're both right, because I am very much in objection to the EU, and that has to do with the multinational vote. That has to do with how Hillary Clinton and other gas companies were able to pressure loopholes into EU legislation, which allowed companies to start fracking in Denmark, and without the communities that allowed test drilling they did not know that if they allowed the test drilling, they had the onerous of showing that it was damaging, and they were the ones who had to take a multinational corporation into court, a town, versus multinational billion-dollar industry. I guess who's going to win that? So on that point, and on the point of judges and the point of the loss of sovereignty, I'm very much against the EU. Now, so to that point, Pat Hacker is correct. To Richard and Adair's point that this is also a racist vote, yes, it very much so is. And yes, it is allowing this segment of society that has been in the shadows to come out. There has been over 50% increase in hate crimes in the UK since the Brexit vote. So let's make no mistake. There are a lot of people out there that voted to leave the EU in part out of fear of brown and black people. So we cannot discount that. But at the same time, we cannot discount the fact that there are people voting against the EU, not because they're afraid of brown people, but simply because they really have some big objections to the EU and what it's doing to what they perceive it to be doing to their country.
Yeah, and Brandon, I see that you're trying to get in here, and I'll make sure you come in shortly. I just, on that point that you mentioned about the non-racial aspect of it, it may be easier for some people to conceptualize and not to lump you in with a less than savory group, but how the conservative argument of states' rights is, and like how that argument breaks down, and that the member nations are losing the ability to negotiate basic things that they need to deal with within their countries because they have to adhere to sometimes cumbersome or ridiculous regulations. And to the point of conservatives, and give credit where it's due, sometimes they do point out regulations that simply just don't make sense, or are ineffective, or are counterproductive. And it is important that you have to have a mechanism to deal with that. And I think what you and a lot of the people that are favor the idea of a Brexit, or of limiting the power of the EU, one of those aspects of it is dealing with, or the fact that they don't have an effective mechanism to deal with those types of things. And so that the concept of the EU isn't necessarily problematic so much as that they lack an effective ability to do what it is that they're dreaming of trying to be effective at doing.
I don't quite agree. The concept of the EU is problematic because it's trying to make a United States of Europe. And you can't make a United States of Europe out of sovereign nations. If you wanted a United States of Europe, then when they said Sieg Heil, you should have said, yeah, that's a good thing, because that was what they were trying to build. Oddly enough, now Germany sits at the head of the table of the EU, and they're now also expanding to the former Eastern Bloc. But that's a whole other thing. But the sovereign nation with a 1,000-year history, not all of them, but a lot of them, capitalizing like this, well, you can call nationhood and nationalization an invention or a human invention, and we can uninvent it again, but it's here, and people feel proud of their country and of their history. Whether or not it's based on false pretense is irrelevant. Enough people do it that it is reality. For example, the Danish Supreme Court is rubber stamping all EU legislation, and all the European High Court, they're rubber stamping all of their decisions. Now, why are they doing this? It's very simple. In the Danish Constitution, it clearly states that the Danish Supreme Court is the highest court in the land and cannot be overruled by any other. So if they at any point overrule the EU Supreme Court, they immediately trigger, basically, a referendum, a constitutional crisis between Denmark and the EU. And since they are not a political entity and do not have an activist judges tradition like the Supreme Court in the United States, they simply don't dare rule on any of it. So they simply just rubber stamp it and let it all sail by. This is one of the byproducts of this. Brandon, you've been wanting to jump in for a while. Sorry, I drone on sometimes.
No. I just want to say I agree with Pat. It's important not to look at any sort of vote, sort of try to make it a homogenized vote and say they all voted this way because of this one reason. There's obviously a lot of reasons why people voted for the Brexit, but we also have to hold people to account for who their bedfellows are in this vote. Like what is this coalition composed of? So same with the Donald Trump voters. There are many of them who are not racist. Many of them are just really, really anti-establishment. Really, many of them are tired of the establishment politics. They see Hillary Clinton as the establishment. They are voting for Trump because of his sort of vague populist message. But they still have to be held account to who are the people who are voting with you? What is your coalition composed of? And we have to break it down. I always say, if you like the book Lolita, you have to come to terms with the fact that many people like the book Lolita for different reasons than you probably like the book Lolita. And part of that is being reflexive about the sort of base, not the base, but the demographics of your vote of your block and what like and it is really and you know sometimes you say like yeah we've come to the same prescription for society but from different points, radically different points, and I disavow myself of them. So you can't homogenize them one way or another. You can't say they're all racist, but you also can't say they're all against corporate sort of multinational domination because that's not the case either.
Okay, so Adair, you have something you want to point in?
I'd like to draw a connection between the two, actually. So we've talked about, at this point, as Brandon was saying, there's two different blocks, and you have to hold your bedfellows accountable. I would say this, though, and we can see this in the U.S. with the parallel with Trump voters. It's a lot of times a combination therein. I think that either side being on that extreme, on that pole, where there's people like you who really have legitimate gripes with the EU, I think there is a selection of people that voted specifically because of that. And I think there's a small selection on the completely opposite end of that spectrum where they're voting strictly because they're racist, e.g. UKIP, right? But I think there's a lot of people in that middle ground who are disenfranchised, who are having issues economically. And because they have economic issues, they then blame, who's the easiest person to blame? Well, the immigrant coming from the Middle East if you're in Europe, or the immigrant coming from Mexico if you're here. And it creates this toxic sort of rhetoric that's backed up by this incredible amount of just abject poverty you can see within working class people. This inability to really move ahead in life because you're saddled down with a bunch of these burdens and you feel like you're doing the best you can. Why aren't you moving forward? So a lot of times we fall back into that toxic pit, and I think that Brandon is very much correct. And you have to hold your bedfellows accountable. As a Bernie person, I have to accept that people that are voting for Bernie are absolutely misogynist trolls, and I don't like it, but I have to accept it, and I have to move forward. Now, if I run into them, am I going to try to work through that and say, hey, what you're doing is not cool? Absolutely, because you must call out your bedfellows on their shit. But I think there's a lot of overlap between this idea of the economic side of things, I'm not going well, and then that racism, that easy target of people that don't look like us, especially because a lot of European countries are fairly homogenous. We talk about Scandinavia having some of the greatest social programs in the world. Fairly homogenous countries, generally speaking. As opposed to you come to the U.S., you're not going to be able to really ever get a universal basic income, which I would love to see, because you have people like Ronald Reagan. It's the Southern strategy all over again. It's Reagan saying, you tell the poorest white man he's better than the richest black man by virtue of being white, and you will always have someone that votes for you. You put their economic woes, you give their economic woes a face, an enemy, someone to fight against, and they're always going to be on your side. And I think we're seeing a lot of that demagoguery on both sides of the Atlantic these days.
Yeah, definitely a lot of that demagoguery, but and I agree with you that you have to address the demons in your group. My problem is with the people who say, oh, we need to reboot, we need to rethink, we need to regroup, we need to reform, is that, okay, so we had the crash of '08, massive failure of leadership, and the response to it was prop up the banks. There was actually a couple of Danish banks that collapsed during '08, and we were actually banks that had lent them money, contacted their governments, that then contacted the Danish government and said, what on earth are you doing letting these banks fail? Now we lost money. And then Denmark went, yeah, you do that. When you invest money, you risk it. And some of this money went away. And they did not understand this concept, apparently. But you had the '08, and you had a massive crisis, and the response was austerity measures, austerity measures, austerity measures, and people were just bled dry by these austerity measures. Then you have the almost Brexit, and again, people were being critiqueful of the EU, and Yanislav, the Greek Minister of Finance, came up with several compromises and came up with several ways in which you could reform and rework the economic system. He was shouted down. The Greek government was told to fire him, or they would not have another meeting with Greece. And then they forced more austerity measures down their throat. Now you have the Brexit. Now, if this does not prompt real reform, you just won't have it. You got to remember the Catholic Church wanted reform for about 300 years before the Reformation happened and the division. They wanted real reform for 300 years. The Inquisition started as a reform, reform the church from within. That was the start of the Inquisition.
Unfortunately for us, we don't have 300 years left in our show. So
I am with that. I'm rounding up. What I just want to point out here is, if Brexit doesn't prompt real reform and reflection, which so far with the grandstanding from the EU and the EU bureaucrats, it doesn't seem like it will, then nothing will. Then it will take 300 years.
Fair.
all right.
Okay, so that was it for Project Sanity and from our first attempt at Crossing the Rubicon deep dive segment. And I want to thank Adair, who you can find on social media, and I want to thank Brandon, also known as a BS Opinion. I want to thank Trang for joining us in our interview, and I want to thank Eric for making that video. And Eric, we will get you back on screen. And I want to thank Benjamin Dixon for allowing us on his channel. And most of all, I want to thank Richard, my partner, co-host, co-founder, and co-creator. And yeah.
And
Richard.
I just wanted to thank everyone. Thank you so much. And I wanted to mention again the video I talked about earlier in the show that was submitted by Lakeisha Rankin was the Empire Files, Propaganda and the Engineering of Consent. If you like this show, you're going to need to go check that out. It's worth it, and it talks about a lot about how we get to the framing of issues like we do today and what this means in corporate America and the EU and Brexit and all that stuff. So great stuff. Thank you again, Lakeisha. And with that, I think we're out.